Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am cooking up some food for a fellowship meal that we were having at church. This was Sunday morning and I got up early so that I had time to make these things to be able to take them to the church. We were having a childhood favorites themed potluck meal, and the first thing I thought of when I read that was macaroni and cheese and something that we call hamburger bean stuff. We never came up with an official name for it, and hamburger bean stuff is what stuck, so that is what we called it. But I'm making the hamburger bean stuff and the macaroni and cheese right now. While I was letting my water come to a boil to cook the noodles, I just used elbow noodles. I was also cooking up about 2 pounds, maybe a pound of ground beef. And I just cooked the ground beef until it was all browned and cooked through. And then we're going to add some things to it. So the first thing I'm going to add is 3 of the smaller cans of pork and beans. This is a really simple meal that I'm pretty sure my mom came up with. And all of us kids loved it so much. We thought it was delicious, but it's not something that everyone in my family enjoys. So I don't hardly ever make it. But when I do make it, it's so that I can take it to share it with other people. So I added my 3 cans of pork and beans, and then you're also going to add some brown sugar and some mustard to this. I think I ended up putting in a little over a half of a cup of brown sugar. It would not have hurt to put more. I think it definitely could have used it. I thought it was sweet enough with the half a cup, but I think people who are used to eating sweet things all the time probably would enjoy having a little bit more. But I did just put a little over half a cup of the brown sugar, and then I probably put 1.5 to 2 tablespoons of mustard in there, and then I just stirred that up until it was all mixed together, and I left it sit on the stove top to simmer for a little while I was finishing the other things I was making. I also signed up to take cinnamon rolls, but decided that morning I did not have time to do that. So I had seen a recipe for lunch lady brownies, I think is what it was called. Supposedly it was a 50-year-old recipe, and I decided that that sounded good and I would give it a try, and it actually was very good. They disappeared, they were all eaten up, and it was super yummy. I ended up having a few pieces myself because it was so good. But I started out with some cocoa powder and just your normal ingredients for making brownies: flour, eggs, sugar, and butter, I think is what we used. I did think it was interesting that this recipe did not call for any baking soda or baking powder, so there was really no leavening agent in this batter, which turned out fine actually for a brownie. It wasn't a cake, it was more of a brownie, and it worked fine to not have any leavening in this batter. But while I was in the middle of doing the brownies, I had to stop and drain my noodles. I did cook the noodles just to al dente because they were going to sit in the crock pot for several hours, and I did not want them to be mushy by the time lunch rolled around. I found this recipe as a post on Facebook, so I'll try to either leave a link for that post or I will type the recipe up in the description box for you, but just know that it is not originally mine. I don't really know where it came from, but someone had posted it and it had popped up as a suggested post for me to look at, and I'm glad it did because it turned out really well. And I will probably be keeping it in my stash of recipes so that I can make it again in the future. The batter for these brownies was very thick, and I thought I know the original recipe said to bake it in a 9x13. My 9x13 pan was dirty and it had some stuff in it, so I didn't want to clean it, so I went ahead and used one of my little sheet pans. It's bigger than a regular baking sheet but smaller than a full-size sheet pan. I think maybe it's a quarter sheet pan or a half sheet pan. Anyway, I was thinking that maybe I could use this spatula to spread the batter out by dipping it in some water, And that proved to be extremely difficult. So what I did was end up washing my hands off and getting them wet and using the water to pat this batter down in my pan. And that actually worked out much better, and I don't mind getting the water on top of the batter like that. It helps to keep it smooth, and it helps to just keep it a little bit moisture whenever it's baking in the oven. Once I got the brownies in the oven, I checked on my hamburger bean stuff and it was coming along nicely. Letting it simmer like this helps it to thicken up a little bit. And then I started working on the cheese for the macaroni and cheese. This is super simple. I just poured some milk into the bottom of my pan. I didn't measure, I just put however much I needed. If you're gonna make this and eat it right away, you don't need as much milk as what I just used. And you can start with a little bit and then add more as you need it. But I put extra since I knew my noodles were gonna soak up a lot of the moisture from sitting in the crock pot. And then to the milk, I put in this whole brick of Velveeta-like cheese. And I just left this sitting on medium-low heat while I was busy working on other things in the kitchen, but I broke the cheese up into chunks. My mom used to cut this up into little cubes and put it in there. It helped it to melt quicker, but then you have to take the time to cut it, and I prefer to just use the spoon and chop it up. And then I would stir it every once in a while it was slowly warming up over the medium-low heat, getting that cheese melted. So while the cheese was melting, I went ahead and made the frosting from the recipe for these brownies. And I doubled the frosting because I had made this in the sheet pan instead of in the 9x13, and I knew I would need a little bit more to cover the whole surface of the brownies. And it actually was the perfect amount of frosting with how big this brownie cake turned out. And people kept calling it a sheet cake, which it did look like a sheet cake, but it was just brownies with frosting on it. So once my cheese was getting all melted, I poured the noodles back in there and gave it a real good stir. And then I did not frost the brownies right away. They were very hot and I wanted to make sure they were cooled so my frosting didn't melt. So I just took the frosting with me to church, and once we got to church, then I put the frosting on the brownies, and that actually makes it a lot easier to transport the brownies. I don't have to worry about things sticking to them or the frosting getting stuck on the lid of my pan or anything like that. So my hamburger bean stuff is looking great. This is about the perfect thickness that I need it to be. So I shut that heat off and put the lid on top of there and let it sit. I added those noodles back into my cheese sauce and stirred it up real good, making sure all of those chunks of cheese were melted and mixed in with the milk and the noodles. And then I transferred this mac and cheese into my crock pot, and I left my crock pot sit on low at home until it was time to go. Then we transferred it to the church, and then at the church I plugged it in and left it sit on low for the couple hours of church before we ate our lunch. I did end up putting some salt on top of this, and then I stirred it up and stuck the lid on. I like to use some rubber bands to hold my lid down so it doesn't spill while we're transporting it in the car. But that was my whole meal that I made to take for our lunch on this Sunday. So I hope you enjoyed watching today. Thank you so much for being here and hanging out. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.